Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. I'm gonna wait a little bit. Hello, Vivi Vision. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. How's everyone? How's my beautiful people? Hey, it's Jui. Hey, Vivi Vision. Hey, Rissy J. Hey, John. How are you guys? Hey, UCLA. How are you today, guys? How's everything? Hey, Superstar Money. How's my beautiful people? Hey, Jerif. Hey, Paola. How's everyone? Yo. Hey, Campus. Hello, everyone. Hola a todos. Hello. Sorry, this night is going to be in English, so if you speak Spanish, my bad. I will do one in Spanish. I will try to, but yeah. ¿Qué más pues? ¿Qué más pues? ¿Cómo vamos? Yeah, guys, so I was listening a little bit. I'm waiting for my guest. It's an awesome guest. And you are wondering how I met him? He's a good friend. So yeah, he's also a professor and he's very talented, but I will wait for him. Maybe I joined a little bit earlier. Hola, primita. When is your live in Japanese? My live in Japanese, I don't speak Japanese, but I already did the interview. Actually, after this streaming, I will share the interview that I did for the CEO of Rogen. Yes, I will share it with you guys. Hey, Better Call Live. Hey, Be Her Berry Photos. I'm waiting for my guest. But guys, I hope you are doing well. Let me know a little bit how this week was for you guys. I understand that we are in a hard situation right now. We are all well concerned because what is happening in the world. So I did this stream. You don't need to follow me or anything, nothing like that. But I think it's important to educate ourselves about the situation and not just from some random person that doesn't have idea or anything. So that's what I asked my friend. He has a really good background. I will let you know what is the background. But he actually has experience and studies. Oh, hey Karim, I'm gonna send the request to you. Hold on. Or send me the request. Okay, let me show you. Where are you? Hey, Fanny. Hey, Skit. Hello. I'm Army Gardener. Hello, Skit. Hello, everyone. Hey.
Hello,
Karim. How are you?
what's up? I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing great. I'm a little bit nervous because we're having this
Why?
conversation. Because you're
It's
so
fine. We
fun.
must have.
I know.
People need
So,
to hear this.
I know. That's what I was telling them, that we need to understand the situation from a
Mm.
professional and academical perspective. So thank you so much for joining me. So let me read a little bit about your background so they know who you are, because you're not a random person.
Okay.
Okay, so Karim is a military strategist from Mexico. He holds a degree in history in the University of Maryland in the US and a master's degree in World Studies from King's College London in the United Kingdom. He has collaborated with think tanks and research groups both in the UK and Mexico. That's impressive. He also has worked directly with the Mexican Navy, doing independent research and participating in war gaming exercises. So, can you tell us a little bit more about this?
Wargaming exercises. I mean, most of them are classified, but what it is, it's the Navy or the Army, whoever's trying to do the exercises. What they do is they simulate hypothetical scenarios. So, for example, here in Mexico, we've ran scenarios. Let's say what would happen let's take an extreme scenario. Like, what would happen if, let's say, the United States and China got into a conflict in the Southeast China Sea? How would Mexico react? And then you basically build that scenario, and then you have a red team and a blue team, and then you have a command center who like kind of runs the whole simulation. And then it's about making decisions. It's really about to see how you would respond, to try to find gaps in the processes and try to find where the weaknesses are, where the strengths are. And it's just a kind of exercise to prepare you for those kind of scenarios. Obviously, it's impossible to predict what those scenarios are going to be, but at least the structure and the organization, you can see where the flaws are and what the good things and the strengths and the weaknesses are. So it's a really fun exercise, because it's the only time you actually get to pretend like you're in an actual conflict, as fun as it is when it's safe. But yeah, it's a really interesting exercise. But yeah, some of the things they run there are classified, obviously.
Yes, of course. And because of that, that's what I invited you, because I know that you have experience like in your background, you said that you had war studies, and I would like to know more about what's happening with the situation with Ukraine. Could you explain us a little bit more about what's happening, like why it started, and then I will ask a little bit more of questions.
Okay. It would be really useful if, as I'm explaining, it would be really useful if people could have a map in hand, because these conflicts, and pretty much any international conflict, is really difficult to understand without a map. And it's much easier. I mean, unless you have your geography on point in your mind, it's really difficult to understand some of these conflicts without a map. So basically, to understand why this happened and why this conflict, this is nothing new, right? I mean, Russia invaded Crimea in 2014, and it's been fighting the West for hundreds of years, right? So this is nothing new, but the root of this is in geopolitics, is in geography. That geography can literally explain the vast majority of why this is happening. So let me explain to you why geography plays a role in this case for Russia.
All right.
The biggest problem that Russia has, or that it's had since the Kingdom of Muscovy back in the 17th century, the problem that Russia has always had is that it does not have any natural barriers to protect itself. It's such a huge country, and it's such vast territory, and there's just no natural barriers to protect itself, right? It's not like the United States, where you have two oceans on one side, then you have basically the Arctic in the north, and then South America, well, Latin America means nothing. Or it's not like you have the UK, which is basically an island, so as long as you control the oceans, you're safe. It's not like some African countries that are surrounded by deserts that are pretty much impassable, so they're pretty safe. It's not like Italy, that's surrounded by mountains in the north and then the ocean in the south, so it's very easy to protect it. So that's how geography determines the safety of states. Russia has a huge problem because there's no natural barriers, right? If you look where Moscow is, there's like nothing around it. It's just plains, right? So that's the main problem for Russia. So the question is, okay, if we have that problem, how do we secure ourselves, right? How do we turn a country into a safe haven, right? And that's exactly, there's many ways to do it, but one of the two main ways to do it is to expand until you reach some kind of natural barrier. That's the first way to do that. And that's exactly what Russia did in the 18th and 19th and even in the 20th century. If you look at the map of Russia, they started expanding in different directions. They expanded first to the east, so towards Siberia. And Siberia by itself is like a great natural barrier because there's like nothing there. There's nothing there. It's impassable. The infrastructure is like non-existent. And then you have the Ural Mountains, and that's like what the border is. And that's a natural barrier. But like Siberia, no one worries about Siberia because no one will dare invade through Siberia. In fact, the Japanese in World War II were thinking about invading Russia. But then when they saw that they had to cross all of Siberia to get to Russia, they were like, no, screw that. We're just going to go and fight in the Pacific. So Siberia is kind of safe, right? So that was one way of expanding. And then they expanded south towards Central Asia, where all the Stan countries are, right? The Kyrgyzstan, Afghanistan, and Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, and all the Stans, right? All that part of Central Asia, they also start expanding in that direction. And then you have a bunch of, that's also very deserted areas. There's some mountain ranges. And so they expanded in that direction. And then that flank was safe, let's just say. But the biggest problem for Russia was never the east and was never the south. It was always the west. That was always the biggest challenge. So the problem that Russia has is that when it expanded in the 20th century, actually probably earlier than that, in the 19th and 20th century, when it expanded westward, in the south, right next to Ukraine, there's the Carpathian Mountains, right? And that's a natural barrier. So that was one of the goals of Russia, is to expand all the way to the Carpathian Mountains, so that at least from the southwest, it will be safe, right? So that's what they did back in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century. Obviously, they lost that when the Soviet Union fell, and they lost that natural barrier, let's just say. But the biggest threat has always come from what's called the Northern European Plain. So it's basically all the territory, all the land that it's like a corridor that runs from northern France, like in Western Europe, all the way to Russia and Moscow, and all the way to like the Ural Mountains. And the thing is, it starts in France, and as it gets closer to Russia, to Moscow, it keeps expanding and expanding and getting larger and larger and larger. So what happens? That has been always the main route of invasion. If you're Russia and you're trying to protect yourself from the West, what you want to do is make sure that plain, that corridor, you have it safe and it's under control, right? So that's the first thing that we have to understand. Geography is one of the reasons why Russia needs to expand a lot so that it can reach some kind of natural barrier. So that's the first way of protecting your borders. The second way of protecting your borders is through what's called proxy or it's called like buffer states. That's the actual term that they use in international relations. Buffer states. What is a buffer state? A buffer state is essentially another state that's not yours, obviously. It's an independent state. It could be an independent state, but that it will act as a shield between you and your enemies. They sit in between, right? And that was the other opportunity that Russia had to protect its land. It's like, well, we're just going to conquer a bunch of these buffer states, and we're just going to use them as a shield. So if the West ever tries to invade us, they have to go through all of those smaller countries before they get to us. And that's going to make their operation much harder. So that was the other thing that Russia and the Soviet Union began doing. They just started expanding and conquering as many of these states as they could to use them as buffers, right? And that's why the most important ones for Russia are Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, Lithuania, Estonia, and Latvia. Right? Because those are literally the entrance to Russia. I mean, that's literally the border with Russia. And again, and this is where it gets interesting, because that corridor goes from narrow to wide as you get closer to Russia. It's much easier to defend it when it's narrow than when it's wide, because when it's wide, you have to cover like 300 miles of ground. You have to defend like 300 miles of ground, and that's a lot of ground to try to defend with your armed forces. So for Russia, to guarantee security, the further west it can push, the safer it is, because that means those buffer states will be placed when the corridor gets smaller. So it's much easier to defend a narrow corridor than it is to defend a wider corridor. So that's why Russia to guarantee its security, it needs to keep not only, again, expanding towards natural barriers, but also keep expanding west with buffer states as much as it can. Like if they can get to France, they should get to France, because that means that they will have all that area to act as a shield from the West, not only ideologically, but also militarily, right? I mean, you just have to cross that. If you have to cross that ground, it's much more difficult. So that's the strategic imperative for Russia. That's in theory, that's how they can guarantee their safety, by accomplishing those two things. Now, obviously, that's in the theory, because in practice, that has proven much more difficult, actually sort of impossible, particularly after the Soviet Union fell. Russia was in no position to be fighting back anybody. So that what happened? The West, all those buffer states that were keeping the Soviet Union relatively safe, the West took them. NATO took them. And now all of them fell under the influence of NATO, the West, and the United States. And so now it was the West that started pushing east. And now it was the West that was conquering, well, maybe not conquering literally, but it was influencing all those territories and bringing them into the alliance and into the Western, pro-Western influence, let's just say. So that is when it got really nasty for Russia, because now all of a sudden you are completely surrounded by Western states. Now, like Finland, I mean, Finland is not part of NATO, but is part of the European Union. So if you just look at the map, Russia is completely surrounded. Finland, the Baltic states, Poland, all of the Baltic, and then Turkey, and then the Caucasus. It's literally surrounded by by states that are Western that have Western influence. The only ones that remain are Ukraine and Belarus. So that's why Ukraine is so key to the national security of Russia. Because if Ukraine falls to Western hands, not only Western influence, let's use that word, because this is no longer about like conquering territories. It's more about having allegiances and influence. So if Ukraine falls to Western influence and it becomes a member of NATO, that's a national security disaster for Russia, because now you have NATO literally on your border and closer to really, really damn close to the industrial area of Russia, which is the southern part, around what used to be Stalingrad, and then towards Central Asia, which is like where, for example, the oil wells are. That like the might of the industrial complex of Russia is in that part of the country. And if Ukraine falls to Western influence, they're going to be right next to it, and you're going to have NATO troops and NATO influence right on your border. And that's something that Russia just cannot allow. I mean, that's like, it's just putting him, it's an unacceptable risk. It's an unacceptable risk that Russia cannot take. Belarus is another story, but Belarus is not as important as Ukraine, but it's also in the same category because also it neighbors Russia, right? And that's when the problem began, because historically, Ukraine was more of a pro-Russian, I mean, the eastern half of Ukraine was more pro-Russian. The western half of Ukraine was a little bit more pro-Western. And what happened in the early 2000s, or in the first decade of the 2000s, was that the Ukrainian government started to develop closer ties with the West. And eventually, at some point, they openly expressed their intention to become part of NATO and become part of the European Union. And that's when the red flags went up for Russia, because it's like, no, this is something we cannot allow. There's no way we're letting this happen. And that's when they started taking action. And that's when you saw the invasion of Crimea in 2014. And that's basically what unleashed this whole thing that we're seeing. I mean, this is nothing new. This comes from centuries back. So ultimately, that was the biggest problem, right? I mean, that's the reason why this whole thing kind of unfolded the way it did. But it's just following an eternal struggle that Russia has had since its inception back in the 17th centuries with like the Kingdom of Muscovy, right? So that's really what's happening. And the point is, for Russia, Ukraine is much more valuable for Russia than it is for NATO, because NATO has a bunch of other buffer states, which is all of the Balkan states and then part of Eastern Europe. Like it has a good buffer, but Russia has run out of buffers. There's no more buffers. Ukraine is the last buffer. So Ukraine is much more valuable for Russia than it is for NATO. So that's why Russia is willing to take bigger risks and invest more in making sure that they control, if not literally, but at least in politically or influence. They have an influence in Ukraine. It's not necessarily that Russia's trying to conquer Ukraine, because the problem with conquering, and this is the only problem with that strategy of creating buffer states, is that the problem is not conquering them, particularly for an army as large and powerful as the Russian army. The problem is not conquering them. The problem is once you've conquered those countries, now you have to appease them. Now you have to control them. Now you have to rule them and run them. And that's really expensive. Why? Because for the most part, those people, for you, buffer states are great, but the buffer states don't like to be buffer states because they're like the puppets, so they don't like it. So to control those states, to maintain them, let's say, under your rule, there has to be military presence. Usually there has to be an oppressive government, and that's really costly, both militarily, economically, and politically. So controlling these countries, once you've conquered them, is a huge problem. That's exactly what happened to the US in the Middle East. I mean, they defeated the Iraqi and the Afghan armed forces in a matter of days. But that's not the problem. The problem is not to invade and conquer the countries. Like, how do you actually keep control of the country? And the United States, the number one superpower in the history of the world, didn't manage to do it in 20 years. So that was a hard-learned lesson for everyone, that conquering territories is no longer viable the way it was, centuries ago. So I don't think, so from that perspective, Russia's not really trying to like conquer Ukraine, right? Because holding it would be a nightmare. Basically, all it wants is make sure that maybe a regime change where now you have a government that's more pro-Russian, so it can actually serve as a buffer zone for Russia. And most importantly, to keep the West and NATO out of Ukraine. That's the most important thing. So that's why they're willing to risk it and they're willing to go for this. And when you understand that, you really put the conflict in perspective, right? I mean, this is not a worldwide global conquest that Russia is trying to engage on. It's just it's mostly a defensive move and a reaction to basically being suffocated by the West. They were getting suffocated from all sides, and they had to fight for a little bit of breathing air, which is Ukraine in this case. So that's the context, I guess. That's the background of how we came to this.
Well, that's very impressive and very I think it puts in perspective, because everyone is thinking that this is going to be like the third world. How do you say?
World War III.
Yeah, World War III. And what do you think, that is possible or is not, that is actually what is going to happen? And also, what about the restrictions that today the US and the allies have decided to do against Russia? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I don't know the full list of economic sanctions, but there's two things that are important when it comes to economic sanctions. The first one, I mean, these are not just any economic sanctions. I mean, we're talking about major, potentially catastrophic economic sanctions to Russia. Some will have an impact more in the immediate term, and others will take longer to really make an impact. But these are no minor economic sanctions. I mean, Russia it's a gamble, and it's a race against time, because Russia, the problem with Russia is that its economy it has so many problems with its economy. On the one hand, for example, one of the biggest problems is that about 50% of its GDP or its income comes from exporting energy, right? Mainly oil and natural gas. Like 50% of your economy, that's a single point of failure, right? And that's going to be a problem because the main buyers is Europe. And now Europe doesn't want to really trade with them, so that's a problem. And then the second problem that has affected Russia throughout all its history is that even though it has vast amounts of land and they can actually produce and they have a great agriculture, they always had a great agricultural economy, the country is just so vast and the territory is just so rough that transportation is a nightmare. It's really hard to transport the food or the product from, let's say, the farms and the rural areas into the cities. It's really expensive. It takes a long time. The food sometimes perishes in the process. So running the economy of Russia is incredibly difficult. And not only that, Russia is a landlocked country. It has nowhere to go in the oceans. It has the Black Sea in the south, and then the North Sea, or well, the Baltic Sea in the north. But he's kind of trapped, because to exit the Black Sea into the Mediterranean, you have to go through the Bosphorus. And the Bosphorus is controlled by NATO, which is through Turkey, which is a NATO country. So you cannot leave. And then in the Baltic Sea, if you want to exit out into the North Sea and the Atlantic, you have to go through the Strait of Denmark, which is controlled by Denmark, which is a NATO country. So there's no exit, there's nowhere to go. And then if you go to the Pacific, Vladivostok, which is like its only major port, the weather is not always, it's not what's called a warm port. So that means at some times of the year, it will freeze. So it's unusable. So Russia's economy is in a really big trouble. So that's why it's a race against time, because Russia has to extract some positive outcome from this invasion before those sanctions really begin hurting. Because not with the economic sanctions plus the problems that it's already been carrying for centuries, I mean, Russia is not going to be able to hang on for too long. So they have to get something out of this invasion quickly before the sanctions become overbearing. So it's a race against time, and that's part of the argument why maybe this whole thing was so aggressive, because they just had to make something happen quickly, because they know that its economy cannot withstand forever, right? Because of how difficult it is to manage it. So that's in terms of the economic sanctions. In terms of World War III, I mean, that's always a sleeping threat, right? And many times, I mean, it's kind of a sleeping threat, and there's always that shadow of nuclear war looming over humankind. But to be honest, if we're reading this right, this is going to remain as a local conflict in Ukraine, because again, Russia has in a global, let's say, in an exchange between Russia and NATO, Russia has no chance. I mean, NATO completely overpowers and outguns Russia by far, right? So that would be a battle that Russia cannot win unless you bring our happy friends the nuclear weapons, right? Because that's nuclear weapons is what kind of, when you're a nuclear power, all the bets are off, right? All the bets are off. When you're a nuclear power, you basically, it doesn't matter how weak your conventional forces are, because nukes can basically make up for all of that, right? So that's always been the risk. Now, how risky is that? Well, the good thing about this whole thing is that Ukraine is not a NATO country. So by invading Ukraine, it doesn't trigger Article 5. Article 5 of NATO is basically the article that refers to collective defense. What that means is that an attack on one member is an attack on all members, right? So if you attack one member of NATO, you're essentially attacking all members of NATO, and then all of them should get involved, right? So that's why no other country has gotten involved militarily in the conflict, because Ukraine is not part of NATO. However, if for some reason Russia crosses into a NATO country, Poland, Romania, the Baltic countries, whatever, if they cross into a NATO country, then we have a problem, because then that would, in theory, that would trigger Article 5, and that's when we could have. Again, in theory, that's when the alliance would have to jump in, and they would have to make guarantee of that Article 5 under the NATO treaty, and that's when things could get eerie. But obviously Putin knows this, right? I mean, Russia knows this. They know this. They know the stakes, and the question is, what would you get out of that, right? Like, what would you get out of that? I mean, all they're trying to do is protect their geopolitical interests in Ukraine. So there's really no reason to go beyond that. There's really no reason to go beyond that, especially when what is at stake is having NATO get involved against you. So that's why it's very unlikely. But again, when it comes to strategy and when it comes to history, it's usually the unlikely things that end up happening precisely because they're unlikely. No one is expecting them. And that's part of the reason why they happen, because nobody is expecting them. So again, there's no guarantee of anything, but it would just defy rationality to push beyond Ukraine into a NATO country, because it's just in a cost benefit analysis, Russia would have so much more to lose than they would have to gain from it. So it would just be an irrational kind of decision. So that's why we're not that worried about it. What might be worrying actually is not so much that Russia might intentionally drive into a NATO country, but that in some way, as it happens in war, they might end up fighting each other out of accident. And that has happened so many times in history, where they're not actually trying to fight each other, but, they get too close to the border, and then, they mistake them for somebody else, and then they shoot at them, and then they shoot back, and then before you know it, they're all fighting each other, and it's like, damn, how did this happen? That is more likely to happen. That has happened so many times in history, when there were strict orders not to, let's say, engage an enemy, but then out of the random chance and friction of war, they just somehow end up in a skirmish, and then that whole thing escalates. That could happen. That there's that potential danger, because NATO is deploying troops along the border of Ukraine, the western border of Ukraine, where the NATO influence starts. There are troops. They are fortifying those areas. So yeah, there's NATO troops next to Ukraine. They're not in Ukraine, but they're next to Ukraine, and there's a risk. I mean, that's just a risk that there might be some kind of accident that has them fighting with Russian troops, and then that's when things could probably get a bit out of hand. But I don't know. I mean, we'll see. Let's hope not.
Someone is asking, guys, if you have a question, there is like a box down there that you can actually type your question, so it's easier to display. But Mute that says, do you think China will get involved if things escalate with NATO and Russia?
NATO, yeah. NATO. So here's the thing, right? China obviously backs up Russia because, again, of their shared history of communism. So, and obviously this is kind of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of dynamic. So obviously China being anti-Western, anti-US, then they will be on the side of Russia. Now, the question of whether would Russia join Russia, whether China will join Russia. In theory, it could. In theory, it might. But in practice, it's extremely difficult. Because again, go back to your maps. How is China going to get troops to Russia? In the north of China, it's the Gobi Desert in Mongolia. Completely impassable. There's no way you can run an army through the desert, through the Gobi Desert. To the west is the Himalayas. How are you going to get an army across the Himalayas, right? Mm-hmm. And then even if you manage to make it beyond that, you still have to cross all of Siberia to get to Moscow. It's impossible. There's no way Chinese forces could reach Russia through land. Mm-hmm. So then the other question would be, well, maybe they can do it by sea, right? Mm-hmm. And that's the other problem. Because the only exit to the ocean that China has is the Southeast China Sea, where they've been in constant conflict with the United States for probably like a decade now. And the United States is still the dominant sea power, completely unchallenged. There's no navy, not even all the navies in the world combined could defeat the US Navy, right? So all the US has to do is block the Southeast China Sea, and China is completely trapped. They cannot go anywhere. No through land, no through ocean. They're just completely blocked from all sides. That's why geography is so important to understand this conflict. Mm. So yes, in theory, yes, China could come and support Russia, but in practice, it's going to prove pretty much impossible. Now that's militarily speaking, because obviously economically speaking, then that's a different story, right? Economically speaking, with provisions, with ammunitions, with weapons, with industry, I mean, that's a different story. So yeah, but in that sense, yeah, definitely. But militarily, the distances are just too vast. They're just so far apart, and just the geography of both countries are just so complex to navigate that I can't imagine it really having any sort of impact, especially when China is so easy to block from the ocean by the US Navy. So yeah, that's how that would play out probably.
So how do you think this is going to end? Like you said about the unlikely things that can happen because no one was expecting that. So what do you think is the outcome of all of this?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, war has, there's something in war called friction, which is the fog of war, which is kind of the uncertainty that we don't know what's going to happen, and the possibility that anything could happen, because surprise is kind of surprise is the nature of strategy in this case. Everything is looking that right now, Russia is about to attack Kiev. Well, I think they already began the assault on Kiev. I was looking at the news earlier, and I think there's already been gunfights in Kiev. So it's probably a matter of hours. Probably they're going to take the capital by tomorrow. Russia's going to take Kiev, and then I think that's when they would call for a ceasefire. Not only Russia, but actually probably Ukraine. Probably Ukraine is going to call for maybe a ceasefire or start to talk about negotiations. And then, I mean, who knows how those negotiations are going to play out? Who knows what's going to be on the table? Who knows what they're going to agree or not agree on? But I think, because once you lose your capital, once you've been pretty much overrun on all fronts, and now you have your civilian population actually fighting, because that's what we've been seeing in many of the videos. They're actually giving weapons to the civilians, mostly the men who stay behind. So now it's like, once you have your civilians fighting, it's probably time to call for a ceasefire. So, the best case scenario, let's just say, the most hopeful and best case scenario is that Russia will take Kiev by tomorrow, and then the Ukrainian president, Ukraine, will just call for some sort of ceasefire, or at least open talks of negotiations, or some kind of open the opportunity for agreements or having a talk. And I'm not sure what that arrangement would look like, but I'm pretty sure that Russia will not settle for anything less than some kind of regime change, some kind of pro-Russian government in Ukraine, and also maybe the annexation of those territories, the ones that are in the border with Russia, Donetsk and Luhansk, which are the ones where the Russian ethnic groups live. So geographically speaking, Russia is trying to connect the Russian border is trying to connect it with Crimea. Because Crimea has Sevastopol. Sevastopol is the port where the Black Sea the Black Sea Navy, the Russian Black Sea Navy is. So it's and right now it's disconnected from the mainland of Russia. So they want to reconnect it to the mainland of Russia, and that's why they're probably going to demand those territories to annex them. But Ukraine, and for the most part, Ukraine should remain, the integrity of the country should remain untouched, aside from that. And I think Russia is just mostly interested in having some kind of regime change that would be more pro-Russian, or at least have some kind of guarantees that NATO and the West will not get involved in Ukraine. Because Ukraine is also important, very, very important for Russia militarily and economically. So Russia, that's why Russia just cannot afford to lose Ukraine to Western influence. So that's the best case scenario. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is that they don't come to an agreement and Russia has to stay in Ukraine for a long period of time. And then we have something like Afghanistan or Iraq all over again. And they just stay in the country. They try to keep control of the country through military presence. They impose some kind of temporary oppressive government, right, like a puppeteer government, something like that. And then this whole conflict would probably transition into a guerrilla warfare, right? The West would probably still not get involved. NATO would still probably not get involved. But then NATO would be supporting what you would call Ukrainian guerrillas, right? So these insurgents, these guerrillas that will be trying to fight back against the Russians. And that conflict could protract for years or decades, right? And it would be really bad for Russia because it would be so expensive to maintain control of Ukraine, particularly when you have the entire West funding the rebels. So basically endless resources. I mean, they will never run out of resources and support. But Russia would run out of that before the West runs out of that. So yeah, that's not. But I mean, in terms of the war, that would be like the worst case scenario for Ukraine in particular. For Ukraine, that would be the worst case scenario. So yeah, that's. I think those are the most likely outcomes. But again, it's anybody's guess. But that's what, at least from a geopolitical and a strategic perspective, that's the thing that kind of would make sense.
So someone is asking you, what do you think Russians' intentions are with overtaking Chernobyl?
Chernobyl is, I mean, as far as I read into it, Chernobyl has no strategic value in the sense that, I mean, it's a deserted city. It's contaminated by radiation pollution. There's radiation pollution in there. So there's no strategic value from it. I mean, the only value of it is that it's just a place. The only value that I see is that it's a place that you can keep stretching your communication and supply lines through it. And the only other value that I see is that once you take Chernobyl, is going to be a place that is going to be difficult to lose. In this case, Ukraine is probably not going to want to fight in Chernobyl because they're still collecting radioactive residue in Chernobyl. To this day, they're still cleaning it up, they're still collecting it, and underground, there's still pretty large deposits of nuclear material, of radioactive material. And if, let's say, there's a fight in Chernobyl, and some bomb, some missile, some explosion goes off in the area where they're doing the cleaning, that could unleash a kind of radioactive pollution to many different areas. I mean, I don't know what the radius would be, but it could really contaminate the air with radiation. So that's a risky thing, and that could be completely by accident. Because again, in a fight, it's just, you never know. I mean, there might just be an explosion that goes off there, and then you have nuclear waste flying over the sky, and now it's going to be polluting all the area around it. So that's why it's probably not a place where they're going to want to fight, because the risk that something could go wrong there is pretty high. But I think that's the only strategic value, maybe symbolic value. Maybe symbolic value could also be something that they could use in terms of propaganda. But in terms of what the city or the place can offer, I mean, there's nothing there. It's been deserted for like 30 years, 40 years. So yeah, that would be the only reasons why it would be worth even having or keeping.
What are the allies or who's supporting Russia besides China and the impact to those countries?
Well, that's the problem that Russia has, and that's why some people call this like a new Cold War. But it's hard to see it as a Cold War, because if you look back at the Cold War, you actually had like probably a half and half, maybe not half and half. It's probably like 3/8 3/8 of the world were supporting the Soviet Union, and then 5/8 were supporting the United States and the West, right? So it was not perfectly even, but at least it was a bit more even. Today, Russia is nowhere near that ratio. The only countries that you could probably say that actually supported are China, maybe again Belarus, the Western Ukraine, and some countries in Central Asia, and that's only mostly for economic interests. But that's about it. I mean, that's about it. They really don't have allies that you can actually count on. There's not that many. So if this is another Cold War, it's going to be a very cold one for Russia. But yeah, it's well, and I guess you could say, you know, Cuba, Venezuela, maybe, who are traditionally communist countries, but when it comes to the balance of power, they really don't make that much of a difference, really. So for all intents and purposes, it comes down to China and maybe North Korea, of course.
Yes, of course. What is the impact for like Latin countries, and especially for Latin countries? What is the impact? Are we going to be impacted?
Yes, of course. Everybody is, because of the economic. I mean, the economic impact is going to affect everyone. I mean, just global markets, the whole economy, particularly in the energy sector, right? Oil prices, natural gas prices. I mean, that's going to be, that's going to be and also the markets. I mean, the markets in general don't respond well to war. Things like gold and the dollar and the reserve currencies, they respond really well to war because, again, they're safe havens, but everything else doesn't really respond well to war. So there's going to be an economic downturn. How long it's going to last, who knows? Maybe it's not as bad, but obviously there's going to be an economic downturn from this, and that's going to hit everyone. In terms of Latin America, I think one of the things we should probably talk about, maybe not in this show, but maybe in another point if you're interested, is that the potential proxy war that is happening between Colombia and Venezuela, because that is actually reminiscent of the Cold War days, where you have Venezuela actually occupying some territories in Colombia that is allegedly theirs, and there's disputes over those territories, and obviously we know Venezuela is backed up by Russia, and we know Colombia is probably on the west side and then the United States side. So this is your typical proxy conflict at the other side of the world, where it's the ideologies behind it and the two major powers supporting smaller nations in a way to push their influence abroad. And that's happening right now in the borders of Venezuela and Colombia. And again, obviously the scale of that conflict is nowhere near to Russia and Ukraine, because these are much smaller countries. But the trend is there. I mean, the trend is there in the fact that you see this conflict, you see this potentially proxy conflict, and it's still a clash of Russia versus the United States, but happening in Latin America. And that, I think that would be the major flashpoint for Latin America out of this right now.
So for Mexico, we won't be that impact like Colombia and Venezuela, or that will escalate to us?
No, I mean, hopefully not. I mean, if that conflict gets all the way to Mexico, then we do have bigger problems. And yeah, no, let's hope not. I mean, I don't think so. I hardly think so. Because again, we go back to geography. Central America is a natural barrier for Mexico. You cannot get an army through Central America. It's mostly jungle, just a bunch of jungle. It's really hard to, like, forest, jungle, really mountain ranges. It's really, how are you going to get an army across Central America? It's really difficult, right? But that's besides the point. I mean, I don't think the conflict will escalate to that degree. So no, for Mexico, I mean, it's hard to tell. I think the economic impact is probably going to be the main one that we're going to feel. But again, we're not alone. We're in the same boat as everybody else on that. And aside from that, I really don't see. I really don't see any other direct or meaningful consequence or impact that this can have in the way things are right now to Mexico. Obviously, if the situation changes, then it could be a different story. But the way things are right now, and the dynamics and the scale of the conflict right now, I really don't see any other major or significant impacts that this could have on Mexico, other than the economic impact that is going to reach everyone. So, yeah, no, not really.
All right. So Orion, a big shout out to Orion, that is my friend. He is asking you, do you think Putin is acting rationally by risking so much far regime change in Ukraine?
Is he acting rationally? I think so. I think so because, I mean, for us in the West, until you understand the geopolitics that I explained earlier, it might seem it's easy to just label Russia and Putin as interventionists, aggressive, just troublemakers, warmongers. It's really easy to judge them negatively. But when you really understand the geopolitics, they do have a case for it. I mean, they do have a case. If you're Russian, and especially if you're the Russian leader, who is now a dictator essentially, and who now you need to justify your position of power, there are certain things that you just cannot allow. And not only for like local and public support, but even for the interest of the country. Again, losing Ukraine is a disaster for Russia. So it's almost like Russia was getting pushed to the point where it was either we fight, either we do something about this, or we just go silently into the night. And when you're given those two options, I mean, the choice is quite clear what you have to do, right? And so I think he is acting rationally. I don't know if rationally would be the word, because there is risk. I mean, with any conflict, even with the invasion of Crimea, when it was using covert operations, and it was not, the soldiers were not wearing flags, and it was kind of this covert disguise operation. Anytime there's a military conflict, you're always risking escalation all the way to nuclear war, particularly when you're dealing with nuclear powers like NATO and Russia. So yes, there is a risk, but I think these are calculated risks. And that's why we have to understand is like these are calculated risks. And even though the action might seem a bit rash, it's not how to put it? It's not impulsive, but it's not reckless. That's the word I was looking for. It's not reckless, right? It's very calculated, and they're very careful to know how far can you push the West. That's something that Putin has become incredibly good at. He has become so good at knowing how far he can push the West. And he's going to push them and push them and push them. And when he feels like he's reaching, the threshold, he's going to back down. And then he's going to wait for things to calm down. Everybody forgets about it. We all go back to being friends. And then he's going to push them again. Because that's essentially what he's been doing for the last 30 or 20 years that he's been in power, right? So that's why I would say he's also acting in a very calculating manner rather than a rational manner. I think that would be but again, there's only so much you can control, because as much of a calculation as he might have in his mind, there's no guarantee that the actual operation is going to play out exactly like that. Because again, the fog of war, the friction of war, there's so many things that could just not go as planned. And that's usually when things go really bad in war. Nobody plans them. It's just the fog and the friction of war. That's what usually makes military and political disasters happen. But that's just the nature of it. So yeah, I think that would be a better word to describe it.
Well, that is so interesting. Like, I'm actually taking so much notes, and for me, I don't know if the guys, but it's very insightful. So thank you so much for that. Can you answer some questions still?
Yeah, for sure. Bring them on.
Okay, so how do you think Russia will retaliate if the U.S. upsets Putin?
How do I think Russia would retaliate if the U.S. upsets Putin? I mean, it's all a matter of degree, right? It's all a matter of degree. I think Putin is pretty upset, and he's been upset at the West for years now, for decades, probably since the times of the Soviet Union. I mean, we have to remember that Putin was the director of the KGB for decades. That was the head intelligence guy in the Soviet Union and in Russia for years. So this guy, he knows all the insides and outs, right? I mean, Russian intelligence is among the finest in the world, and he was ahead of it for years, right? So this is not just any cowboy that's in power. So I think one of the things, the good things that Putin has going for him is that even though he's been upset, again, he's been very calculating. He's an incredibly smart guy. He knows how far he can push things. He knows how far he can take it. Because obviously it's not in his interest to have an open war with the West, because that's a war that Russia cannot win, and there's no benefit in it. You're just going to lose more than you're going to gain. So it's just that would be completely irrational. Fighting the West over something short of existential threat to the Russian state in my view, is just completely unjustifiable, right? So it's difficult to gauge how he would react or retaliate with the US, because it's just, I think this is actually how he's retaliating. This is his way of pushing back against the West, but in a very calculated manner. I think one of the things, at least, that we can read from Putin is that he's very calculating, and he's very prudent in his decisions, right? He's assertive and aggressive, but prudent. And there's a difference, right? He's assertive with his decisions. I mean, we see how aggressive he's being. He's being very assertive. I mean, this is sending a very clear message to the world, but he's being prudent about it. He's not being reckless. It's not like, just go ahead, boys, have a field day, go loot Ukraine, you know, have at it. It's not that kind of thing, you know. It's really calculated, and it's really it's prudent to a degree. So I think this is his way of retaliating, and he's been doing that in several ways. Not only militarily, but also economically and politically, also by like aligning himself with China, for example, or supporting certain anti-Western factions in different conflicts. He's like, it's almost like he's trying the strategy of the death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? He cannot deal, other than nuclear weapons, he cannot deal a decisive blow to the West. So it's more like the small actions that are going to, again, a little cut here, a little cut there, another cut here, and then eventually 1,000 little cuts, and now you're bleeding to death. So I think that's more what his approach is, which again is a decisive and assertive approach, but he's just prudent. It's prudent because I think a guy like Putin, he knows how far he can push it. He knows where the limits are. So yeah, I think that would be my take on that.
Another question is, do you think Russia will go beyond Ukraine if this campaign is successful for him?
No, because of what I explained earlier. And I mean, I'm not going to repeat that, but I'm going to give you another reason why not. The idea that Russia would be able to replicate this anywhere else in the world is very unlikely, for two reasons. First, the areas that they're invading in Ukraine, they are pro-Russian, right? All that eastern side of Ukraine is pro-Russian. I mean, these are minorities, ethnical minorities that are basically Russians. They speak Russian. They have Russian, ethnically they're Russians. They're like Russians trapped in Ukraine. They identify more with Russian than they do with Ukraine. They favor the Russian government over the Western government. So you're invading an area that sees you as a liberator in a way. So there's a bunch of support from the locals. They're so happy to have you, right? It's like, finally he came and got us here. So that makes things so much easier, because now you don't have to really fight or struggle to control those areas, because the whole population is really happy to have you there. That's not going to happen anywhere else in the world. Outside of the former Soviet sphere of influence, that's not going to happen. You're going to encounter hostile populations, and even if you manage to subdue them militarily, you're still going to have to control them. And there are going to be protests, there are going to be insurgents, there are going to be rebels, and it's going to be a nightmare to really suppress and control those areas. So the idea that you can replicate this anywhere in the world is really not that feasible. And then the other problem is, this whole invasion is kind of easier. Well, not easier, but it's logistically it's simpler for Russia, because just the proximity with Ukraine. I mean, the basis of operations are so close from Ukraine. It's literally in your border. So the logistical lines, communication lines, supplying lines are pretty straightforward because of how close you are to Ukraine. The further away you get from Russia, the harder the logistical challenge gets, because it's not the same to ship weapons, reinforcements, supplies, food, whatever you need, to ship it from Russia to Ukraine, than to ship it from Russia to China, or to ship it from Russia to Western Europe, or to the United States. I mean, the logistical challenge of doing that is it's like impossible, right? So that's why it's really difficult to think that Russia could be able to pull this off anywhere else outside of basically its neighboring countries. Right. I mean, there's obviously the idea that Belarus could be another, maybe not so much, because Belarus is still more pro-Russian, let's just say. But the Baltic countries, and even Finland maybe could be potential targets for this. Like this could happen. Technically, it could happen in the Baltic states and in Finland, again, for the same reason, because there's minorities there that have closer ties with Russia, and it's closer to Russia. So those could maybe be a potential flashpoint, but beyond that, it would just it would prove so difficult that it would hardly be feasible.
So for the society, like in Russia, how it will affect them? Like, are they going to face more poverty? Like, what's going to happen, like with society, like in general, the impact of that?
Yeah, I was actually researching that this morning because I was not that well informed in that. I mean, I'm still not, but at least I did a bit of research on that this morning. I think 20% of 20% of Russian population lives in what would be considered poverty by UN standards. Again, economically, Russia has always struggled because of again all the problems I mentioned earlier with its economy. So now you're going to put Russia through the economic sanctions. You're going to put Russia in a situation in which the economy is going to be affected, the supply is going to be affected when an industry that is half of your income, your GDP, is pretty much shut down, not completely, but in a significant amount, which is the energy sector. I mean, that's just disaster. That's just a doomsday for the population, for society. I mean, Russia, for the most part, there's a few things. Russia is for the size of the country, is one of the least populated countries in the world for the size of it, right? The population density is like, it has to be the lowest in the world. It has to be, because there's the size of the place and how many people actually live in it. It's just the population is not, the population density has to be so low. And so that's the problem. The problem is that the production of Russia's, let's say, goods, consumer goods, that's what they're called. The consumer goods are usually produced in the countryside, in the rural areas, the agricultural areas, for example, and then they have to be brought into the cities, into the urban areas. And like we said, that's incredibly challenging. It's expensive because of how vast the distances are and how rough the terrain is. So it's really expensive to manage that. So if on top of that, if you add economic sanctions to that already difficult challenge, I mean, obviously the people are the first one that are going to suffer. Now there is a problem because, and obviously there's been protests. I mean, there have been some protests in Russia because of the war, but we have to remember that protesting in Russia is not like protesting in the West, in the US or in Mexico or in free countries, right? Protesting in Russia lands you in jail, right? And if you protest too hard, you might just get banished, right? You might just disappear overnight. So protesting that's the problem. That has been a problem that Russia has had, again, since like the 17th century. It has only been through oppression of its people that they've managed to keep control of it. Again, because of the nature of its geography. It's only been through in majority oppressive regimes that they've been able to keep control or keep the society on their wraps, let's just say. And that's another reason why Ukraine cannot fall. Well, why Putin in particular cannot afford to have Ukraine fall to Western influence. Because imagine if Ukraine became imagine for a second that Ukraine became a Western country, pro-democratic country, pro-European, member of NATO, for example, and then obviously it's going to have to reap all the benefits of capitalism and trading with the West and all that, and it's going to become a really affluent and rich country and whatever. All those Russians that live in the border with Ukraine are going to be looking at Ukraine and it's going to be like, hey, it seems like they're doing pretty well for themselves. Maybe that system of government is better than Putin and what we have here in Russia. And now you're going to have to start, because remember, I mean, us in the West, we take freedom of speech for granted. And we just take it, it's just, we just live with it, right? We don't know what it's like not to have it because hardly we haven't had it in history. But when you live in a country like Russia, when not only the freedom of speech, but also the access to information is pretty skewed and limited and controlled by the state, that's the sort of thing that could really start getting people's minds wandering. When you're just looking at your neighbor, some of them who you might know, because again, there's close ties between Ukrainians and Russians, and it's like, hey, it seems they're doing pretty well for themselves. Do we really need Putin here? I mean, it seems like there's a better option out there, and then that might be a political threat for Putin. I mean, for local and political support. So that's contamination of ideas, you could say, right? He doesn't want the people to get contaminated by Western influence. So that's why he needs to keep Western influence as far as possible geographically from Russia. So that's why you cannot afford to lose Ukraine to Western influence.
What is the possibility of actually losing it after this?
I mean, after the, I don't think. What would be the possibility of losing it after this? I don't think there would be any possibility, at least not in the short term. At least not in the short term, because I don't think NATO would be willing. Let's say Russia takes Ukraine and imposes its own government, and it just becomes a pro-Russian state. Like I said, Ukraine is much more valuable to Russia than it is to NATO. So I don't think NATO could justify an invasion of Ukraine or a liberation of Ukraine under any circumstances. It's just not that valuable for NATO. It's much more valuable for Russia. So that's why they're willing to go all the way to this for it. But I don't think NATO would be willing to take it back. At least not in the short, immediate term in the way of a military intervention. But again, they will probably play the long game. They will probably play the long game again, because they would start covertly through, again, propaganda, trade opportunities, maybe some kind of political arrangements, like slowly but surely try to get Western influence back into Ukraine. But that's going to be a very long process. That's going to be a very long process of influencing the country into Western, into Western ideals or Western allegiance, right? So yeah, I don't think that in the short term we probably wouldn't see the West trying to take back Ukraine, because it's just not worth it compared to how much it's worth for Russia.
What do you think about crypto market and the influence and the impact? I know that all the markets, including crypto markets, have gone down, but do you think that maybe they will try to find something there to have stable value?
Yeah, I was actually going to. I mean, I'm not the expert in crypto. You're the expert in crypto, so maybe you can teach me about this. Because I was actually going to. No, I read about this, but I was actually going to ask you about this because, I mean, I don't think I know enough to know the right answer, but I think there's a few things that make sense, and that would be cool to discuss. So the first thing is, one of the things that I noticed, and this has been all over the news, is that people in Ukraine, they haven't been able to access cash, right? Because again, they're going to, I mean, the money is there, although it's probably going to devaluate, but the money is there, but just the ATMs ran out of cash. And there's no one working at the banks. The banks are pretty much closed. And now people are just hanging with their credit cards and the debit cards. And it's like, hey, I can't withdraw any cards. I don't have any money. Like, the money is there, but I cannot access it. That's one problem. But then the other problem is, like, if your banking institutions collapse or they get taken over or something happens to them, like, what happens to your money? Because it's the bank that's safeguarding your money. And I think that's when cryptocurrency can maybe be a valuable asset. I don't know if we could call it as a reserve currency, because I think it's more like an asset rather than a reserve currency. But I can definitely see the value that when you have this decentralized currency, you're not depending on the survival, let's say, of your bank. You don't need it, right? It's living in the blockchain and in the cyberspace. So I think that's if I get that right, if that's actually how it works, I can totally see how crypto could be safer, at least in this regard. Maybe not safer in terms of investment, because it's probably more volatile, but at least safer when it comes to something like this, when an actual bank, let's say in a situation of war, we could maybe say that crypto could be safer because it lives in the virtual space. It's not dependent on any physical bank or any centralized institution or a government or a state, and therefore maybe it's a safer place where you keep your money. So I don't know. I mean, what do you think about that?
Yes, exactly. Because of that. And we have a good example, like when Canada closes the accounts and they have to go into Bitcoin to invest there, so they can actually be found from people all over the world, and they don't have the limits. And even Vitalik, the founder of Ethereum, he says that Ethereum is neutral, but he's not. But like, that statement for me means a lot, because even Russians, well, I think Russia is going to forbid like cryptocurrencies, Same with China, because they know the potential of that, which is funny because I do believe that all the governments have invested like in crypto because they see the value
that's
of that.
the question. You know, that's something to think about. And this is the other thing I was wondering is, okay, maybe Russia might want to ban it because again, it would, if people start shifting to crypto, then they would lose control of that. I get that. But just thinking about it, Russia, in this case, Russia in particular, because of the situation, might be interested. I mean, I'm just thinking. I mean, I don't know to what extent this would actually work out. But with all these economic sanctions, if Russia would embrace crypto as its main currency, I mean, I know that sounds a bit preposterous to say, but to what degree could that maybe help sidestep the economic sanctions? Because it's like, I don't need your dollars anymore, or your euros, or your pounds, or anything, because now I have crypto. And guess what? There's no way you can block it. You cannot sanction my crypto. You cannot stop my crypto transactions. So now all your economic sanctions, maybe not all of them, but many of you trying to block me from the international banking system, which is what they've been arguing with in regards to SWIFT. You blocking me from the international banking system is not going to hit me as hard because now I have access to the crypto marketplace, let's just say. Again, I don't know to what extent that's doable because, I mean, we're talking about the economy of a nation. It's not just, your typical trader changing a few Bitcoins here and there. But in principle, at least in my mind, that could work to an extent where it's like, hey, all your economic sanctions are good for you. But now I'm in the crypto space. So I don't know. Do you think that's doable? Does that make sense?
Yeah,
I mean, is that realistic?
Yes, actually, when you say it that way, that is a big danger for yes, that can be very possible because everything is decentralized. Even if they don't invest like in Bitcoin, they can invest in a stable coin that it matches the value of $1 is the same that one of the stable
it
coins.
follows the market.
So yeah, now that you put it that way, yes, that is very likely. Like it's possible. No one.
So stable coin. Yeah, that's the thing. That's the thing. I mean, obviously, if they block them from the international system, it would still have disastrous consequences for them. But then maybe they can mitigate it a little bit, because now it's like, hey, all these payments that you have to make to us, and all these payments that we have to make to you, we can still make them. We're just going to use crypto instead of using the international banking system. And there you go. Use the blockchain, and it will go through. So it can keep the mill going, at least, I think. But again, I don't know how that would be implemented, or if that's doable at that scale.
I think that most of the
it's an interesting idea. Yeah,
all of the big governments, including China, well, I have read some of them. They actually have invested in crypto and all of that because of this, because they know that, in my opinion, maybe I might be wrong. No financial advice. Like in long term, banks are going to be outdated because of this problem of being centralized, and everyone is going to go to decentralized. For example, in my case, I don't own like fiat or cash or anything because I know that is inflation. How do you say inflationary?
Inflation.
Like it has
inflationary coin. Yeah.
But with the crypto, you don't have that problem, because if you invest in one that is deflationary, actually it makes it more valuable and so on, and you can pay with that. So I do believe that. But
okay, so help me understand this. If you own crypto, inflation still affects you because the price of things are independent of crypto, right? Like if you use crypto, let's say you get paid in crypto, your salary, you get paid in crypto, and then you eventually have to cash that out because many places still don't take crypto. So you still have to trade it for cash. So in that way, you still get affected by inflation. I mean, you still have to pay higher prices every year because just inflation within a country goes up.
But it still will depend on who is accepting payments with crypto and with currencies like Bitcoin, like Ethereum. Right. And right now, there are a lot of, it's growing and growing and growing and growing. Like even with the NFTs. For me, in my personal opinion, I would rather invest into some, not all of them, NFTs or something that it's related to the blockchain rather than oil or even gold. Because eventually that is a problem. And we go to the same thing, like being centralized or that.
Well, gold is an interesting one, isn't it? Because I think gold, I mean, the thing that makes gold so valuable, I mean, maybe not so valuable, well, it does make it valuable, but just so safe, is that it's an actual tangible it's an actual tangible item that holds value, that holds agreed value to everyone, and that's why it's been like the reserve, maybe not, well, coin, I guess you could say, or the reserve commodity for a long time. Because my worry with I mean, there's this concept of the single point of failure, right? And that's what worries me, because if let's say the entire world switches to crypto and the blockchain and all that technology is still dependent on other technologies, even as basic as the internet, even as basic as networks, electricity. I mean, they're still dependent on that. And if one of those goes down for a temporary or prolonged period of time, then the whole thing collapses. The whole damn thing collapses. And then it's only, I mean, the virtual world is only valuable as long as we can keep it online. And I mean, for now, there seems to be like no risk of that, right? It's like, well, what could happen that could bring down the entire global network or the entire, internet system? But that's the sort of thing that's like a single point of failure. Like if you're really thinking in the extremes and in the long term,
yes,
that's a single point of failure. When in reality, when the piece of gold, right, the gold coin or the bar of gold, it's like as long as you can keep it with you, and as long as you can physically protect it and own it, it will hold its value. It will hold its value, and it's the safest asset in that way. And I think, I mean, you probably agree with this. I mean, I think that's why it's the key in all of this is always diversify, right? It's diversify, exactly. diversify. So, but yeah, that's an interesting idea. I think, I mean, I haven't gone that deep into crypto and NFTs. I mean, I understand how they work and I understand the basics of it, but I haven't gone that deep into it. But I think there's definitely geopolitical ramifications to the decentralization of banks, because it's not just about individuals trading with their NFTs and the crypto, but if a national banking, if a state moves its national banking system to crypto, now that's a game changer. Now that's a game changer, because now they're kind of operating outside of where everybody else, which is a good thing and a bad thing. For example, because the good thing is that now it's safer in the way that it's now it's not dependent on any centralized or institution or organization. But then the bad thing is that might not be feasible until everyone jumps on board, because then you could end up exactly in that situation where it's like, hey, okay, we all embrace crypto, yeah, but the rest of the world hasn't, the rest of the states haven't. So now they're not going to take your Bitcoin, they're not going to take your crypto. It's going to be really difficult to have exchanges until they begin to adapt the same currency or method of exchange. So I think it's that case where it has to be this kind of a majority migration to it for it to work, because if only a couple of states do it, the cons are probably going to outweigh the pros. But if a bunch of countries do it at the same time, or at least major trading partners do it at the same time, then that's when it could actually work out, because they're both on the same page. I think the problem might be when it's only a few countries that are doing it, but then the whole international banking system is not going along with it, so they're really having a hard time. They just bought more problems for themselves. So yeah,
but
I mean,
but there is also a big growing of communities like with the DAO, like DAOs, where there are decentralized organizations, and they're basically doing like a lot of different kinds of projects, from IDs, passport, like all of that, real estate, to all of that, like all are like real life organizations. They are moving into decentralized. So yes, if we depend on what we have done for the last whole life in humanity, that makes sense. But everything is moving to that way, especially with the Web3, when we want to take back the power. So it's very likely and very possible that even if countries start to try to close, we are going to still find like places, like communities, and that actually, in my opinion, will give them more power, because that is proving actually the point of being decentralized. The more that the centralized try to shut them down, is giving them power. With Bitcoin, we can see that they have tried.
So what's the weakness of, let's say, cryptocurrency, in the sense, because if it's decentralized, how is it that China or Russia could actually block it, for example?
What do you mean?
Because you said that China and Russia are trying to ban crypto from people from using it, right? Because again, it would reduce the power, control, or influence that they would have on the decentralized banks would have. But if it's a decentralized coin that by definition does not respond to anyone other than its own community, how are they going to ban it? I mean, how are they going to stop people from using crypto?
That is the interesting thing, because, well, they can block like the exchanges or something like that. But for example, if people takes into the cold wallet where you have your crypto, they cannot do anything. Like,
what's a cold wallet? Sorry for my ignorance, but
no.
I'm
like,
so behind on this.
No. The cold wallet, let's say that is like an USB where you hold all your crypto or your currency.
Physical,
so it doesn't,
right.
It's physical. So yes, of course you use exchanges to buy crypto and all of that, but they say that no your keys nor your crypto. So that's why you have to have always your wallet. That is a cold wallet that doesn't depend on anything. Like even what you just said about if the internet goes down and we have like a crisis, if you have your cold wallet, still you have your crypto. So
so that they can't stop, but they can stop the online transactions.
Exactly, like online transactions or
but how
exchanges.
I mean, I don't know exactly how the blockchain transactions work, but how are they going to stop them? How are they going to block transactions from happening?
Like exchanges, like for example, in like regulation, like just like places like Binance or Coinbase, or where you have easier access to all of that.
The platforms where you do the exchanges, they could ban it. So the website, they basically block the website, so now you cannot. All right, that makes sense.
But they cannot limit or forbid Ethereum or Bitcoin. That is going to exist anyway, because the blockchain you can, unless that you stop like the whole computers of everywhere, and that is not possible. Like what? No, I don't think that they are going to, because that will include the whole blockchain, and that is not possible.
Yeah, that makes sense. Interesting.
I think. Yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
For example, in Cuba, and when they have limitations with internet, some people have found like the way to become rich because they were investing in crypto. So they had access. As long as you have access to the internet, pretty much, or you know how to move into the web, you will have access to your crypto. And even let's say that I have my crypto in my wallet and we have a crisis and I don't have internet, but still if I can connect to the blockchain, I have my crypto.
Because they have like ATM, I think I saw it, right? Like crypto ATMs where you could take your cold wallet, let's just say, and then you just plug it in and then you just get cash back. Right. So in a way, do you think that, okay, maybe this is a different question. Is there going to be a physical Bitcoin, let's just say, because let's say you get rid of all the currencies in the world and we're just left with crypto. If you go to the ATM, because you actually need to pay with cash, what's the cash? If there's no more currency, like what, because there's no exchange, like how do you, what do you withdraw?
What you just said was you just withdraw, like either way, like if you just move cash, that you are not gonna need cash. You just will pay with.
Or you pay with a cold wallet, like it's like here, just plug in my cold wallet and charge it there.
That happened, I think, in what is the country in Central America? Honduras, I think is the one. Honduras is the one. Yeah, I think Honduras is the one that accepted Bitcoin, like legalized crypto. And that's what they do. So, or make just a transaction, like a normal transaction. You don't even need like cash. For example, with me, with the NFTs, I don't even need to put my money there. Of course, in the beginning I did, but when you start to move into the atmosphere of crypto,
I think you're cutting off. There you go.
sorry. That was a call. Okay. So it means, for example, in the NFT space, if someone tried to sell to me an NFT, I start to buy and sell with Ethereum. I don't need like normal money. The whole market is built into that currency. So I don't longer need more like normal money. For me, what I do, for example, is I don't have, like I told you, I don't have any more fiat in my bank account.
Yeah.
But I do have all my crypto, because actually even when you stake, they give you even more, like 7%, which in the bank is just like less than 1%. And what I do is with my credit card, I pay everything, and just with my profits or every month, I just take
just
out.
Pay the credit card. Right.
I just pay the credit card.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. Right. Well, but I'm guessing that for this, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a utopia, but that's, I mean, that seems to be so far into the future, because for this to work at a global scale, basically, you would need to get everyone in the world on crypto for it to be a global currency, right? I mean, everyone would need to have access to computers, the internet, accounts, and I mean, it's easy for us to say, like in the, in more developed countries, it's like more realistic. But when you go to countries where, sometimes they still don't even have access to the internet, they don't even have smartphones. I mean, it's hard to see. It's hard to see, but but maybe that's not even the goal, right? That's not even the goal.
No, everything
that's not even the goal.
Yeah. So everything starts with something big, and then goes to. At the end of the day, they will figure it out how to do it. So I don't think even small countries can find a way, because Honduras or other countries, like for example in the Philippines, the NFTs have changed a lot of people. They have given them even better income than the normal jobs.
Yeah, for
so
sure.
I do believe that, like what we were saying, like in the communities in the Web3, that is what is making so much changes, because it's communities that have been built that are stronger, that you don't actually need anymore the cash, and you start to build communities. For me, that's why is my focus. Communities will change everything, because the moment that you realize
it's a perceived value. I mean, it's with cash. I mean, the Bitcoin is going to be worth, the crypto is going to be worth what the community feels it's worth. They determine the value, because again, it's not backed up by anything physical. So it's perceived value, let's just say. But so that's why if there's a strong community, that actually raises the value of the coin, because they have more trust in it.
Exactly.
So, that's an interesting model. That's an interesting model, because usually the what would make a currency reliable is how reliable the state was. It's like if it's a stable state, if it's a stable country, if it's a safe country, then the value of that coin goes up. I mean, that's why the US dollar is like the reserve currency of the world. But when you shift that to where you no longer need a state or an entity to act as a guarantor of a protection for the currency, and now it's just the trust of the community itself. I mean, that's a completely different model. I mean, that's just a complete different model. I mean, I wonder how reliable it is, or how well, not reliable, but how resilient it is. But it's an interesting experiment. So technically, you get richer by building a bigger and stronger community.
Yep, actually.
That's funny.
That is actually a source of rich and new jobs.
Yeah, a source of wealth. Yeah, because it's like, hey, let me just buy a bunch of crypto, and then my job is going to be to get everybody else to buy into it, to love it, to trust it, and that's just going to drive the value of it. And so I get richer by just making everyone jump into this space, and that could be your job. That's so good.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh my word.
Yes,
that is such a mindfuck.
Yep. So we'll have to discuss this in another show, because I know that you have to leave.
Yeah, no, for sure. Yeah, I have to go in a few minutes, but hey, this was lovely. I really enjoyed that. I hope that was educational, that you got something out of it, and I'm glad to come back anytime you want to talk about this and any other things I could contribute to.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you so much, Karim. I appreciate you a lot, and I hope to see you soon.
In person.
In person, yeah.
Yeah, because this whole virtual thing can only go so far. We still need to be out in the real world.
Yeah, I know. And you know how I am. So focused that I forgot about everything. But I promise
it's okay. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. Okay, cool. Thank you so much, Wendy. And cheers. Have a good night, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Take care.
Bye.